millionaire arrived at his farm and found a single black mother of triplets in the house. What he did. The shiny black Porsche stopped abruptly in front of the farmhouse, kicking up a cloud of red dust. David Wellington got out of the car, adjusting his gold Rolex, his blue eyes scanning the property with the arrogance of someone who owns everything he sees. The 200-acre farm had been purchased as an investment 3 years ago, a millionaire's whim that he never had time to visit. Until today. What the hell, he muttered as he saw children's clothes hanging on the clothesline he had never installed. The sound of laughter coming from inside the house made him quicken his pace. His Italian boots stamped heavily on the porch steps as he pushed open the front door, which should have been locked. The scene he encountered left him petrified. 3 black children, apparently triplets around 4 years old, were running around the living room playing tag. A young woman, also black, was folding clothes on the sofa, his sofa, humming softly a melody that echoed off the walls. "Who are you?" David's voice cut through the air like a knife. The woman froze, her hand still holding a small t-shirt. The 3 boys ran to hide behind her, their big eyes wide with fear. I can explain, sir," she stammered, trying to compose herself. "My name is Grace, and these are my children, Tyler, Jordan, and Marcus." David took a menacing step into the room. At 45, heir to an oil fortune, he was used to being obeyed without question. Trespassers on his property were unacceptable. "Explain? Explain." His voice rose an octave. "You broke into my property. This house is worth $2 million. Grace hugged her children tighter, her voice trembling but maintaining a surprising dignity. "The house had been abandoned for years, sir. We had nowhere to go after." "I don't care about your pathetic story," David cut her off, grabbing his cell phone. "I'm calling the police. You have exactly 5 minutes to pack your things and get out of my house." That's when Grace did something unexpected. Instead of begging or crying, she looked him straight in the eye with a calmness that completely disconcerted him. "All right, Mr. Wellington," she said, using his last name without him having introduced himself. "We'll leave." David paused with his finger over the emergency number. How did she know his name? "But first," Grace continued, her voice now rock-solid, "would you like to know what we found in the attic while we were here?" The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the wall clock. David slowly lowered the phone, something in her expression making his stomach clench. Grace smiled for the first time since he had arrived, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that carries dangerous secrets. What had that woman found in the attic of his farmhouse? And why did David suddenly feel that perhaps he should have investigated the history of that property more thoroughly before buying it? If this story of confrontation and buried secrets is piquing your curiosity, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what Grace discovered in that attic was about to turn David Wellington's life completely upside down. David slowly put his phone away, his eyes never leaving Grace's face. Something about her demeanor bothered him deeply. There were no tears, no desperate pleas as he would have expected from a poor trespasser being evicted. "The attic," he laughed dismissively. "Lady, I bought this property 3 years ago. I know every square inch of it. There's nothing up there but dust and junk from the previous owners." Grace adjusted one of the boys on her hip, her smile remaining unchanged. "Are you sure, Mr. Wellington? Because we found some very interesting things about the Morrison family, and how they lost this land." David's blood ran cold. Morrison. How the hell did she know the name of the family who had sold him the property? "Listen here," his voice dropped dangerously low. "I don't know what game you're trying to play, but it's over. Now." He took 3 long strides toward her. "You're a homeless squatter with 3 brats, trying to blackmail me with made-up stories. You think I'm going to fall for that?" For a moment, something flashed in Grace's eyes, not fear, but something that made David recoil unconsciously. "Game," she repeated softly. "Mr. Wellington, I am Grace Morrison, great-granddaughter of Samuel Morrison, who built this house with his own hands in 1924. David's world seemed to tilt. Morrison. Morrison. "Impossible," he stammered. "The Morrisons were white." Grace finished, her voice sharp as a blade. "My great-grandfather was white, yes. My great-grandmother was a freed black woman whom he loved against all the conventions of the time. They built a family here, raised children, prospered." Her voice hardened. Until people like you decided our land was worth more in your hands. David felt the ground disappearing beneath his feet, but his arrogance prevented him from admitting anything. Even if that's true, and I'm not saying it is, I bought this property legally. I have all the documents. Of course you do, Grace nodded. Documents very well forged by a lawyer named Richard Hayes, who coincidentally was also responsible for forging the documentation that took this land from my family in 1978. How did she know about Hayes? David had paid a fortune extra precisely so that this lawyer could resolve the complicated legal issues surrounding the property. Grace continued, her voice now laden with a deep pain that cut through the air. Do you know what excuse was used to evict my family? Back taxes. Taxes on land that my great-grandfather had paid in full for decades. She looked him straight in the eye. The same taxes that mysteriously doubled in value the week before the collection. The triplets had stopped playing, sensing the tension in the air. Tyler, the bravest of the three, tugged at his mother's skirt. Mommy, is this man going to make us leave? David looked at the children and felt an irrational hatred. How dare they stand there, in the house he had bought, looking at him as if he were the villain. Look, he said, his voice dripping with contempt, I don't care about your family stories. I don't care if you're the great-granddaughter of whoever. I bought this property, I pay the taxes, I decide who stays here. He picked up his cell phone again. And now you're going to leave, or the police are going to take you away. But Grace didn't move. Instead, she set Tyler down on the floor and walked calmly over to an old suitcase in the corner of the room, a suitcase David hadn't noticed before. Before you call, Mr. Wellington, you might want to see this. She opened the suitcase and pulled out a worn leather briefcase filled with yellowed documents. David's stomach clenched as he recognized some of the papers. They were identical to the ones Hayes had shown him during the purchase. This folder, Grace said softly, contains the original property documents. Purchase contracts, birth, marriage, and death certificates for 4 generations of the Morrison family. But the most interesting, she smiled again, are the letters. What letters? David tried to sound confident, but his voice came out hoarse. Grace pulled out a sealed envelope. Letters my grandfather wrote, but never had the courage to send. Letters detailing exactly how Richard Hayes and his clients conspired to steal land from black families throughout the region. She looked at David with an expression that made him gulp. Letters that specifically mention the name Wellington as one of the frequent buyers of troublesome land. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of cars on the country road. David felt cold sweat running down his back. How was this possible? Hayes had assured him that all traces of the property's past had been taken care of. That doesn't prove anything, he muttered, but it didn't even sound convincing to himself. Grace closed the folder with deliberate care. Maybe it doesn't prove anything on its own. But combined with the bank records showing your father's payments to Hayes over 30 years, she paused dramatically. And the recordings. Recordings. The word came out of David's mouth like a strangled whisper. My grandfather was a careful man. He recorded several conversations with Hayes and his associates. Very enlightening conversations about how the land grab scheme worked. Grace tilted her head. Conversations that mention not only this property, but at least a dozen others that your family acquired through the same methods. David felt the world spinning around him. If those recordings existed, if they were made public, it wasn't just the farm he would lose. It was the entire family empire. It was decades of reputation. It was everything. But then his arrogance returned with full force. Who would believe a homeless black woman against a Wellington? Who would care about old recordings of a dead old man? Even if you have something, he said, regaining some of his confidence, who's going to believe you? You're a trespasser, Grace. An unemployed single mother with 3 kids to feed. I'm David Wellington III. He squared his shoulders. Do you really think anyone is going to take your word over mine? That's when Grace did something that caught him completely off guard. She laughed. It wasn't a bitter or sarcastic laugh. It was a genuine, almost cheerful laugh, as if David had told the best joke she had ever heard. Oh, Mr. Wellington, she said, wiping a tear from the corner of her eye, you really didn't do your homework before buying this property, did you? David's confidence began to crack again. What the hell are you talking about? Grace walked to the window, looking out at the road leading to the city. Let me tell you a little story about homework, Mr. Wellington. For the past 5 years, while you were busy spending dirty money on imported cars and expensive watches, I was in law school. David's blood ran cold. That's right, Grace continued, still looking out the window. Grace Morrison, graduated magna cum laude from Columbia University. Specialized in property law and racial justice issues. She turned to face him, and now David could clearly see what he had missed before: the sharp intelligence, the absolute confidence, the meticulous preparation of someone who wasn't there by accident. "And do you know what the topic of my master's thesis was?" she asked, walking slowly back to the document folder. "Legal recovery of ancestral property stolen through document fraud and racial conspiracy." David felt his legs give way. He had to lean against the doorframe to keep from falling. Grace opened the folder again, but this time she took out much more recent documents. Court petitions, search warrants, requests for audits of property records. She leafed through the papers as if reading a menu. All duly filed in federal court 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks. David whispered. 2 weeks, Grace confirmed. Interestingly, exactly the same amount of time that my children and I have been living in this house. Our real home. David's world came crashing down around him. She wasn't a desperate squatter, it was a meticulously planned legal trap. And he had walked right into it. Each new humiliation only fueled something inside Grace that David couldn't see, a determination that had been forged by pain, tempered by education, and sharpened by justice. What that arrogant man didn't know was that every word of contempt, every condescending glance, was only confirming what she had always known: some privileges are only lost when you take them with your own hands. David tried to regain his composure, adjusting his tie as if that could restore his control over the situation. "Listen here, Grace. You may have studied law, you may have filed your fanciful petitions, but that doesn't change the fact that I have unlimited resources. My legal team will bury you in paperwork until you give up." Grace smiled softly, walking into the kitchen. "Coffee, Mr. Wellington? I just made some." The absurd normality of the offer made him even more angry. "Coffee? Coffee? You're being sued in federal court, and you offer me coffee." "Actually," Grace said, pouring 2 cups, "you're the one being sued. Multiple federal charges, document fraud, conspiracy to steal property, civil rights violations." She counted them off on her fingers as if they were items on a shopping list. "Oh, and tax evasion. We discovered that you never reported the reduced taxes you paid on these problematic properties." David took the cup with trembling hands. "My lawyers will prove that I bought everything legally." "How interesting that you mention your lawyers." Grace picked up the phone and dialed quickly. "Because I have a call to make." Before David could protest, she put the phone on speaker. The call was answered on the first ring. "Grace. How is my favorite lawyer?" The male voice that came out of the phone had a refined accent and absolute confidence. "I hope our friend Wellington is behaving himself." David almost dropped the cup. That voice. He knew that voice. "Mr. Wellington," Grace said calmly, "I'd like you to meet my partner at Morrison & Associates, Thomas Richardson." David's world collapsed for the second time that day. Thomas Richardson wasn't just any lawyer, he was the lawyer. Senior partner at the largest civil rights firm in the country, famous for taking down billion-dollar corporations in racial discrimination cases. Richardson. David stammered. "But you've represented Wellington Oil for 15 years. The laughter that came over the phone was as cold as ice. "I did, David." Past tense. "Interestingly, I discovered that my firm was being used to legitimize land theft through fraudulent documentation. Imagine my surprise." Grace watched the expression of growing horror on David's face. "Do you remember the internal audit that Richardson and Partners conducted last year? That routine review of all property contracts?" David remembered. It had cost a fortune in legal fees, but Richardson had assured him it was just standard procedure. "Every document forged by Hayes," Richardson's voice continued over the phone, "every suspicious transaction, every irregular payment, it's all documented and stamped with Wellington Oil's signature. 15 years of evidence, David. Courtesy of your own company." You betrayed me," David whispered, reality finally penetrating his arrogance. "I redeemed myself," Richardson corrected. "There's a difference." Grace, I have to go. The FBI is here to review the documents you sent. FBI? David felt his legs give out completely. FBI. Federal crimes require federal investigation, Grace explained, as if teaching a child. Interstate conspiracy, tax evasion, documented fraud in multiple states. The Justice Department became very interested when Richardson handed over 15 years of evidence. David slumped heavily onto the sofa, his mind trying to process the magnitude of the disaster. How much do you want? Grace tilted her head. Pardon. Money. How much do you want for this to go away? $1 million? 5? 10? The expression on Grace's face changed completely. The professional calm disappeared, replaced by a coldness that made David recoil. Mr. Wellington, she said, her voice sharp as a blade, do you really believe this is about money? She walked to the window, watching the triplets playing in the yard. Tyler had found a bird's nest and was calling his brothers over to see it, their childish voices full of wonder. My great-grandfather built this house after the war ended, Grace continued, still looking outside. He could read and write when most men like him couldn't. He saved every penny for years to buy this land legally, paid his taxes religiously, raised a family here. She turned to David, tears glistening in her eyes. My grandmother was born in this house. My father took his first steps on this porch. And you stole it all with a pen and some forged documents. David tried to speak, but Grace cut him off. You want to know how much I want? I want my children to grow up in the house their ancestors built. I want every family that lost their land to schemes like yours to get back what is rightfully theirs. I want men like you to learn that privilege is not a license to steal. Grace's cell phone vibrated. She glanced at the message and smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. Ah, how perfect. Mr. Wellington, it seems the media has discovered our little situation here. She held up her phone screen. CNN, The Washington Post, The New York Times. They're all on their way. David turned completely pale. How did they find out? Because I told them. Grace put her phone away. A young black lawyer reclaiming ancestral land stolen by an oil dynasty? A millionaire CEO confronted with evidence of decades of fraud. She laughed. That's exactly the kind of story the media loves. The distant sound of helicopters began to grow on the horizon. David rushed to the window and saw 3 dots rapidly approaching. No, 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 he muttered, desperately grabbing his phone. Richardson, pick up. Pick up. But Richardson's number went straight to voicemail. Grace watched David panic, frantically calling numbers that didn't answer, sending messages that weren't replied to. It was almost tragicomic to watch a man who had controlled empires with the flick of a finger now completely powerless. You know what the most interesting part of all this is? Grace asked conversationally, picking up Tyler when he ran inside, frightened by the noise of the helicopters. David stopped dialing, looking at her in despair. Richardson wasn't the only lawyer who discovered your little operation. It turns out Hayes kept backup copies of everything, as a kind of life insurance. Grace rocked Tyler gently. When he died last year, his widow found a safe full of evidence. Guess who she called first? David felt as if the ground had completely disappeared beneath him. Hayes' widow. A very interesting woman, Mrs. Hayes. Very concerned with justice, especially after discovering how her husband had acquired all that wealth. Grace smiled. She will be a very eloquent witness at your trial. The helicopters were now clearly visible, and David could see cars approaching rapidly on the dirt road. Grace, he pleaded, all his arrogance finally crumbling, please. There has to be a way we can work this out. I didn't know about Hayes, about the forged documents. It was all him. Grace stared at him for a long moment, her expression inscrutable. Then, slowly, she walked to the front door and opened it. Mr. Wellington, she said, her voice now laden with an authority he had never possessed. In 15 minutes, this porch will be filled with reporters asking questions about how your family built an empire by stealing land from black families. Cars were pulling up in front of the house. David could see people getting out with cameras and microphones. Grace adjusted Tyler on her hip and looked David straight in the eye. You have 2 choices. You can walk out the front door and face the questions. Or you can walk out the back door and let them draw their own conclusions about why the great David Wellington was running away. For a moment, David thought about begging again, about trying to appeal to her mercy. But when he looked at Grace Morrison, mother, lawyer, rightful heir to the land he had stolen, he saw something that made him finally understand the true extent of what he had faced. There was no mercy in her eyes. There was justice. And justice, David was learning, was far more frightening than any revenge. It was when the first voices of reporters echoed outside that David realized the true genius of Grace's plan. She hadn't just collected evidence or sued him. She had orchestrated a public trial that would destroy not only his freedom, but his reputation, his empire, and everything he held dear, under the eyes of the entire world, broadcast live to millions of people who would finally see a privileged man pay for the injustices he had committed. David looked out the window and saw his worst nightmare coming true in real time. 3 CNN vans, 2 ABC crews, helicopters flying over the property, and an army of reporters setting up equipment in the farmyard. "How did they get here so fast?" he whispered, panic finally breaking through his facade of control. Grace smiled, adjusting Jordan on her lap. "Because I called them last night. I told them today would be the perfect time for an exclusive on how one of the richest families in the country built their empire by stealing land from black communities." Last night. David turned, reality finally hitting him. You planned all this." "Every detail," Grace confirmed calmly. "From the moment I chose this farm to invade, to the exact timing of your arrival. Did you really think it was a coincidence that you decided to visit your abandoned property today?" David felt his legs give way completely. "How did you know I was coming?" Grace laughed softly. "Because I planted the information that reached you myself. Richardson told me about your paranoia about investments. All it took was a few rumors about suspicious activity on the property for you to rush here to check on your assets." The first knock on the door echoed through the house. David could hear reporters' voices outside, cameras being tested, generator engines starting up. "Mr. Wellington." A female voice called through the door. "Rebecca Torres, CNN. We'd like to ask you a few questions about the document fraud allegations." David rushed to the back door, but Grace intercepted him with frightening ease. "I don't recommend running away," she said conversational. "The FBI has been parked on the back road for 20 minutes. Special Agent Patricia Kim. She'd love to talk to you about federal tax evasion." "FBI?" David stammered. "How, when?" "When Richardson handed over 15 years of documentary evidence last week," Grace explained patiently. "They were just waiting for the right moment to act. What a coincidence that that moment is right now, isn't it?" David's cell phone vibrated incessantly. He glanced at the screen, 47 missed calls, hundreds of messages. His secretary, the company board, investors, his ex-wife. Grace watched him check his messages, her expression remaining serene. "Oh, and David? You can stop looking for the Wellington oil backups. Your server was seized by the FBI at 6 a.m. federal warrant." David slumped heavily into his chair, finally understanding the magnitude of what he was facing. How long have you been planning this?" 5 years, Grace replied, beginning to tidy up the boy's toys with deliberately calm movements. "Since the day I graduated from law school and vowed to reclaim our land." Another knock on the door, more insistent. "FBI. Mr. Wellington, we need to talk." Grace walked calmly to the door and opened it. An Asian woman in a dark suit showed her ID. "Agent Kim." Grace greeted her like an old friend. "He's here. Exactly where I said he would be." David watched in horror as Grace casually talked to federal agents about him, as if he were an object of study. "Mr. Wellington," Agent Kim approached, "you need to come with us to answer some questions about tax irregularities and fraudulent documentation." I have the right to an attorney," David muttered. "Of course," the agent nodded. "Although Richardson and Associates formally withdrew as your representatives this morning. Conflict of interest, according to them." Grace approached David one last time, her voice low but perfectly audible to the cameras that had already entered the house. "Do you know what the difference is between us, Mr. Wellington?" she asked softly. "You used your privilege to steal. I used my education to reclaim what was rightfully mine." David looked around. FBI, cameras, reporters, bright lights. his reputation being destroyed live for millions of people to see. The family empire crumbling in real time. But why this way? He pleaded one last time. Why not just a normal court case? Grace picked up Tyler, the three boys now watching the people with cameras with curiosity. Because court cases can be buried, Mr. Wellington. Lawyers can be bought. Judges can be influenced. She smiled. But the truth broadcast live to the whole world? That's permanent. As David was escorted out by federal authorities, the cameras captured every moment of his public humiliation. Grace remained on the balcony with her children, watching the man who had stolen her ancestral inheritance being led away under the merciless lights of media justice. What David Wellington didn't know was that Grace had saved one last surprise, a revelation that would turn his fall from scandal into complete personal tragedy, proving that some revenge is served not only cold, but with a precision that completely redefines the meaning of poetic justice. 6 months later, the New York Times headline was crystal clear: Wellington Empire declares bankruptcy after federal investigation. David Wellington III was sentenced to 15 years in prison for fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy. His company was dismantled, his properties auctioned off to pay federal fines. The man who once controlled billions now shared a cell with common criminals. Grace Morrison, on the other hand, had become a national phenomenon. Her firm, Morrison & Associates, was thriving, specializing in recovering stolen ancestral lands. Universities vied for her lectures on racial justice and legal strategy. On the porch of the restored farmhouse, she watched Tyler, Jordan, and Marcus playing in the same yard where her great-grandfather had taken his first steps. The fourth baby was growing in her belly, a new generation that would grow up knowing its roots. "Mommy," Tyler ran to her, "the teacher said you're famous." Grace smiled, adjusting her son on her lap. "I'm not famous, sweetheart. I just did what was right." Richardson called that afternoon. "Grace, we have 30 more families wanting land reclamation lawsuits. The Wellington case has opened the floodgates." "Perfect," she replied, watching the golden sunset over the property she almost lost. Justice isn't revenge, it's preparation meeting opportunity. David had tried to destroy her with arrogance and prejudice, but it only strengthened her resolve. He underestimated a mother who turned pain into purpose, education into a weapon, and patience into absolute victory. The best revenge is not to stoop to your opponent's level, it is to rise so high that they become irrelevant. Grace proved that when you combine intelligence, preparation, and justice, you can bring down entire empires. If this story of overcoming adversity touched your heart, subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that true strength comes from those who turn injustice into fuel to achieve the impossible.